as. So in between the two as's, we have positive adjective, and in front of all that, we have not. Welcome to the Lingomaniac lessons, a corner for language learning and usage means, tips, and tricks. The Lingomaniac lessons, for nerds, by nerds. Today, we will be focusing on the second group of parts of speech, and those are the adjectives. I'm Jelena, a master philologist. I've been a teacher for almost 20 years of English, French, Spanish, and Serbian, actually Balkan languages. I've also been a translator for almost 20 years in English, French, Serbian, Balkan languages, basically Italian and Spanish. We can divide and classify the adjectives into several different groups. Of course, since we had the first group of the nouns, which were proper nouns, of course, the first group of classification of adjectives would be the proper adjectives, and those are basically derived from the proper nouns, but not from all, just a part of them. For making the proper adjectives, we are using mostly the names of the countries and add the suffix in, is, or ish to the noun, to the proper noun. In some of the cases, we use the names of continents, and we basically form the adjectives by adding the suffix n. For example, from Europe, we've got European. From Africa, we've got African. From Asia, Asian. Japan, Japanese. Taiwan, Taiwanese. China, Chinese. Or Poland, Polish. Mongolia, Mongolian. That's how basically the proper adjectives formation functions. Now, also, as with everything in English, we have some irregularities. So there are certain countries that we cannot derive the adjectives from. For example, for Holland or the Netherlands, the adjective would be Dutch. For Switzerland, the adjective would be Swiss. For France, it would be French. For Greece, it would be Greek. So there are certain irregularities that we have to pay attention to. But as long as all the other proper nouns are concerned when creation of the proper adjectives is at stake, we cannot basically form them. So we use nouns as the adjective. The typical example of that would be London Bridge. Okay, so that was about the proper adjectives, which was the first group. Second biggest group of adjectives in English language is, of course, the group of descriptive adjectives. And they are used to describe literally all the qualities of a certain person or object that you can think of, from age, size, heights, so on and so forth. Now, some of my colleagues, and of course some people, recommend learning them in opposite pairs, like big and small, old and young, cheap, expensive. That is one way how you can learn them best, but personally, I believe that the contextual learning is actually the best. So if you are to, for example, learn some adjectives which are in a certain group, I would divide it, for example, learn the adjectives that describe different kinds of age. Learn the adjectives which describe different kinds of shape. But those are the biggest groups of adjectives, so basically we don't have any specific things to point out about those. Second group of adjectives, actually third group of adjectives, are demonstrative adjectives. As the name itself points out, they demonstrate, they point out to something, and they are pointing out usually time or place distance. Whether something is close in place or physical distance in space, or something is far in time or physical distance, and whether something is in singular or in plural form. So for something which is close to us but in singular form, we would use the adjective this. For example, this mic. For something which is in singular form and far from us, either in place or time, we would use the adjective that. For example, that year when I was third grade of my elementary school. If we're talking about something which is in plural, but something which is close, we will use the adjective these. For example, these hands or these rings. If we want to talk about something which is far from us, and again in plural, we will use the adjective those. For example, those books behind me, because of course these rings are a lot closer than those books. That's all we have to say about the demonstrative adjectives. Next ones that we have to pay closer attention to, which are oftentimes tricky, are adjectives of indefinite quantity. So these are the adjectives which show certain quantity, but the quantity which is not numerically specified. The first pair is some and any, and the second basically triplet is much, many, a lot of, and its additional form lots of. So when we're talking about some and any, they are both used with plural countable nouns and with uncountable nouns. Now, some is used in positive statements, any is used in questions and in negative statements. So basically in interrogative and negative statements. Which form of nouns are we missing? Well, we are missing countable nouns, but in singular form. So pay very good attention to this. For singular countable nouns in positive, interrogative, and negative sentences, we will never use either some or any. We will always be using the indefinite article a or an. When we're talking about the triplet, much, many, a lot of, or it's a bit more informal form, lots of, the situation is as follows. Much is always used with uncountable nouns. Many is always used with countable nouns in plural. A lot of and lots of are used with both uncountable nouns and countable nouns. Now, what is the difference? And of course, all three, actually four, are used in positive, negative, and interrogative sentences in questions. What is the difference? Well, the biggest difference can actually be seen in question forms, in interrogative sentences. When you use much and many in interrogative sentences, it has the context that you are expecting in a reply that the quantity is not big. If you're using a lot of or lots of, you are expecting to get a reply which shows that the quantity of something is big. But now let's turn this abstract explanation into something more practical. When you say, for example, haven't they sold many tickets? You are using many because you are expecting the response to be no. No, they haven't. You are expecting the amount to actually be small. When you want to point out that you're expecting a larger number, then you will be using a construction with a lot of. or lots of. For example, haven't they sold a lot of tickets or haven't they sold lots of tickets? Then it suggests that you are expecting the answer to be yes. So those are the biggest differences when we're talking about adjectives of indefinite quantity. And I hope this, finally solves all the mysteries when we can use which one. The next group of adjectives that I would like to mention are distributive adjectives. And there we have one pair, which is a pair each and every. Usually seen as a tricky pair. Not problematic at all. When we are using each, the context of that adjective means that we refer to each, but literally. So literally every single thing, item, or person which is described with that adjective is included. When we say every, it means that we actually point out to things in general. For example, each colleague from my company got a present for New Year. That means that each and every single person, from the top manager to the cleaning person, so every employed person in that company, without exceptions, got a present. When we say, for example, every man likes football or every woman likes shopping, that means in general, based on the majority of the tested specimens. Why? Well, for example, first of all, I'm the woman who doesn't really like and doesn't really obsess over shopping, so I'm the first one, denying that each category and turning it into every. So when we're talking about every, we are talking about general behavior, general attitude. Of course, not every man likes football. Of course, not every woman likes shopping, but majority do. And the last group that we will mention today in the division are very, very important possessive adjectives. Possessive adjectives show possession. They actually mark the owner or owners of a certain object marked with a noun. Now, in English language, each person has its own predetermined adjective which is being used, so we don't form them by any way. There is a predetermined word which is used as an adjective for each person of singular and plural. For the first person singular, it's my. Second, your. Third person singular, his, her, its. And for plural, our. For the first person, your for the second person, and their for the third person plural. What is very important to mark and to memorize, or actually to acquire and to pay attention to until you acquire by practice, is that these adjectives can never, absolutely never stand alone in a sentence and have full meaning. So any adjective, whether it's proper, whether it's descriptive or possessive, it cannot have full function and full meaning in the sentence if it is not connected to the noun that it actually determines, because it determines the noun. So if you say it's my, it can be whatever. It just shows that I am the owner. So we don't have the full meaning until we use the noun behind. And that is very important to note with the possessive adjectives, because there is also an additional group of words which are pronouns. And possessive pronouns are very usually misused and confused with possessive adjectives. So that's why I'm pointing it out as basically the most important thing. Now, When we are also talking about adjectives, we need to point out that as much as the nouns, they don't go through different kinds of changes, as in some of the languages of the world languages it happens, the changes through the case system, through the numbers, through the gender, and so on and so forth. The only change that the adjectives can actually go through is the comparison of adjectives. And that comparison of adjectives is the quality of only descriptive adjectives. So descriptive adjectives are the only one that can actually change, and that change is called the comparison. As much as, for example, if you remember from the previous videos, when we mentioned that only common countable nouns have a type of change, which is the plural of nouns. So this is also the similar kind of case with the adjectives. Now, when we are talking about the comparison of adjectives as the only change that descriptive adjectives can have, of course, there is what? Regular and irregular comparison. So, regular comparison of adjectives has two different forms, and that one is based on the length of the positive, or basically the base form of the adjective. If we're talking about one syllable, so-called short adjectives, which means that they only have one vowel, or short two-syllable adjectives, and those are adjectives which have what? Two syllables, but specifically those that end in Y. For example, happy. Those adjectives have one type of forming the comparison. For the comparative form, they add suffix er, or just r if the adjectives end in that mute e, to form the comparative. For example, big, bigger, nice, nicer, or happy, happier. The superlative form is formed when we add the suffix est, or just, of course, st if the adjectives end in e. For example, the biggest, the nicest, the happiest. Now, you have to pay attention again to one very important thing. Actually, two important things. One of them is about the formation itself. All of those short two-syllable adjectives which end in Y, in letter Y, again have that Y rule. They also apply that Y rule. And for majority of adjectives, you have to be focused in written form. If there is a consonant before Y, like in the adjective happy, that Y will change, transform into I, and then you will be adding ER for comparative and EST for the superlative. That is one thing. The other thing, which is also very important, is that we always use the definite article the in front of the superlative forms of adjectives. So, big, bigger, the biggest, nice, nicer, the nicest, and happy, happier, the happiest. The second formation of, the regular formation of comparison of adjectives is reserved for all of the other two-syllable adjectives. So basically all which don't end in Y letter, and multi-syllable adjectives. So those who have, which have three or more syllables. They use specifically comparative and superlative forms of two irregular adjectives to form both the comparative and superlative forms. For the comparative form, they will be using the irregular comparative more in front of the positive form of the adjective. And for the superlative, they will be using the irregular superlative form, which is the most, and then the positive form of the adjective. So, for example, adjective handsome. Handsome. So, two-syllable adjectives. Two-syllable adjective doesn't end in Y. Therefore, it classifies here. Comparative will be more handsome. Superlative, the most handsome. Three-syllable adjective, for example, beautiful. More beautiful, the most beautiful. Four-syllable adjective, for example, intelligent. More intelligent, the most intelligent. And that's all we have to say about the regular comparison of adjectives. When we are talking about irregular comparison of adjectives, there are basically 11 adjectives which have irregular forms. And of course, some of the most used ones are precisely those. The first one, which is irregular, is the adjective good. Comparative and superlative forms are better, the best. Then we have a triplet. We have three adjectives which have the same comparative and superlative forms, and those would be the adjectives bad, evil, and ill. All three of them, as a comparative form, have the form worse, and as a superlative one, they use the form the worst. Then we have already mentioned the following two ones. Those are the adjectives of indefinite quantity, adjectives much and many. Both of them have the same comparative and superlative, and those are the forms more and the most, which are used to actually form the comparative and superlative forms of those long two-syllable and multi-syllable adjectives in regular adjective formation of in regular comparison formation of adjectives. Opposite of much and more is basically all little, and its comparative and superlative are less and the least. Now, we are coming to some adjectives which can be a bit trickier. The first adjective, well, actually the next adjective, but the first one of those trickier ones is the adjective near. Its comparative is fully regular. The comparative form is nearer. But for the superlative, we have two different possible forms. For the superlative, one of the options is to have the completely regular superlative, which would be the nearest. But the other option, and that's why it actually goes into this irregular group of comparisons, is the next. So for near, we've got options nearer, the nearest, and nearer, the next. Next adjective is the adjective far. And oh my God, you wouldn't believe how many people actually has issues with the comparatives and superlatives of this adjective, because it has double possibilities for both. One of the options is to have the form farther and the farthest. So basically it between the adjective and the regular suffix, it inserts the th letters, which again makes it irregular because it's not the direct suffixation of the adjective in the first place. So it cannot be completely regular in the first place. So farther, the farthest. Second option is to have it in the form of further, the furthest. Now, what is the difference in the usage? That is where the tricky part is. When we're talking about superlatives, the forms of the farthest, the furthest, there is no difference. We can almost say that they are synonymous, that they can be interchanged or used, whichever suits you best at that context. But there is a slight difference in the comparison usage. When we use farther, we usually use it to denote something which is, more far than we are in the distance. But when we use further, it is mostly used in the context of a certain meaning, and that meaning is additional or something extra, bonus. For example, for any further information, please don't hesitate to call us at any specified moment. So for any additional information, and that context will never be applicable with the comparative form farther. So only further has that meaning and mostly that usage. Next adjective that we need to mention is the adjective new. That adjective is also kind of a bipolar, or it has two double forms like the adjective far. One of the forms of comparative and superlative is to use a completely regular comparison. So to have forms of new, newer, the newest. I usually see these usages in a bit more informal speech, in an informal usage. So we can say that it is basically a mark of contemporary informal usage. While the other comparative superlative form is mostly used in a bit more formal situations. In that situation, comparative form of new is more modern, and the superlative form is the latest. And now, let me ask you, how many times have you actually heard a sentence, the latest issue of our magazine can be purchased or bought in the stores? That's basically the latest issue is basically the superlative form of the adjective new. The last adjective that I will mention is the adjective old. That one also, as the adjective far, sparks up oftentimes some discussions and debates because it also has two different forms. Whether we are talking in general or whether we are specifying in a certain group. For that adjective, we have two different forms of comparative and superlative as for the adjective far. One form is older, the oldest. The second form is elder, the eldest. Now, what is the difference? When we are using the forms older, the oldest, that form of comparative and superlative can be used to describe both people and objects. If we are describing people, then we usually use it to describe people which are not connected through the family relations. So, if I sit with a group of my students and we start talking about the age, we will be probably talking about who is older and who is the oldest. Unless those students are somehow connected to me through the family relations, like the siblings, parents, children, grandchildren. In that case, we will be using the second form of comparative and superlative, and that is elder and the eldest. So basically, for stating out the order or the sequence in a certain family, we will be using that form. And how many times, just ask yourselves, how many times have you heard, for example, John the Elder? meaning or marking John Sr. if there is also John Jr. If a father and son, for example, have the same name. So we will be marking one as elder and one as junior. Or if you want to say that you have brothers or sisters, you will be describing those relations using elder, the eldest. For example, I have 3 brothers. John is the eldest, but I am elder than Tom and Bob. And let's now just repeat once more which are irregular. So good, better, the best. Bad, evil, ill have worse and the worst. Much and many have the comparatives and superlatives as more and the most. Little, less, the least. Near, nearer, the nearest or the next. Far, farther, the farthest, or further, the furthest. Then we have new, newer, the newest, or new, more modern, the latest. And we have old, older, the oldest, old, elder, the eldest. There is one more adjective which oftentimes shows up with some irregularities, but I mean, we can mention it, but it's not as usually used as these adjectives. That is the adjective late. Its comparative form can actually be found in two different forms. One would be later, the other one would be latter. What is the difference? Well, later, of course, means more late than the positive one, than the previous one. And that one would be the one which refers to being after in time. That's where, well, that word actually, that comparative of adjective, is also used as an adverb which describes time. Latter is the form which is used to describe something which was mentioned later. In my elementary school, I learned English and French, latter being the language which I started learning first. So that word latter would actually refer to the one which was mentioned later. And that latter is usually a part of the fixed expression or a fixed phrase which you might have heard in English language, and that is former and latter. So when we don't want to repeat previously mentioned words from the previous part of the sentence or the previous sentence, we just refer to them as former and latter, meaning first time mentioned and second time mentioned. And of course, the superlative of that adjective would be the last. So please don't mix late and new, because from new, the superlative is the latest, but from the adjective late, superlative would be the last, the one that actually is the last one in line to come. That is all which we have to say about the division, basically, of comparison of adjectives, about the regular and irregular comparison. There is one other thing that I would like to point out, and these are those are ways to modify comparisons. There are 3 very common or unusual ways which are used in communication, how to modify these comparative structures. First, very well used and basically very usual way of using comparatives is that you use the comparative form of adjective with the word then, with the comparative word then. And it is used to compare 2 different items that we are talking about. So basically 2 different objects of our talk. Not more, just 2. And we are making the comparative relation between the 2 of them. Please pay very good attention to the comparative then and how you write it. It is written with A, so it's THAN. Don't mix it up with then, which is the time expression, which is written as THEN. So please, that is also one of the very often, well, either lapses or mistakes which happens in the written form of English communication. Second form, the second way to modify, basically comparisons, is by showing equality or inequality, the phrase for showing equality or inequality. That is the so-called as phrase. And that phrase always in between those 2 ases, just to mark a bit on the plurals, just to make sure that we understood the last lecture. As ends in s, therefore for the plural we would need to add which suffix? Es. So in between those 2 ases, we would have we always put the positive form of the adjective. So if we want to say that something is completely equal in a certain quality, we would say, for example, this table is as expensive as the other one. This car is as fast as the other one. If we want to show inequality, then in front of that as positive adjective form, as construction, we will put not. So we will have not as positive adjective as. So in between the 2 ases, we have positive adjective, and in front of all that, we have not. For example, this car is not as expensive as that one. And the last thing that I will focus on today, the third way of modifying comparatives and basically modifying comparisons or comparison structures, is so-called graded comparative. That construction is made with using the adjective much in the positive form in front of the comparative form of a certain adjective. Whether that comparative form is regular or irregular, doesn't matter. We put much in front of the comparative. For example, this washing machine is much more expensive than our old one. So it's not just more expensive. So it's not just a plain comparison, but it is also not the most expensive which exists, but it is more expensive, by a certain decent amount than the old one that we have. So basically, graded comparative lies somewhere in between the comparison and the superlative. It's not just a comparative form, but it's still not the highest level that the superlative form is. So it's somewhere in between. That is all that there is to be said about the division and changes that the adjectives go through. I hope that this was useful. If you have any questions or any comments or any suggestions, please leave them in comments. I will address them, and maybe I will also learn something new, because when you are dealing with languages, you are constantly learning. So if you have any smart suggestions, or, well, since there are no stupid questions, please ask whatever might confuse you, whatever might have confused you. I will do my best to answer every comment specifically, and in as much as detail as I can. And if you enjoy this, well, join me the next time.